Hikers wandered up into a clearing and made a chilling discovery. But it gets worse. The area doesn't exist. Dilapidated homesteads, towns, Iranian cafes, and even caverns, all vanishing as if they had never existed. This episode will take you through 5 witness accounts that feel like they are straight out of the Twilight Zone. I'm Josh Ninocchio. This is What Lurks Beneath. You won't want to miss this one. When Caleb was 12 years old, he and his 10-year-old brother Evan had an experience in the woods near their home that neither of them would ever forget. The boys lived with their parents and their younger brother Micah in a neighborhood that backed up to a large cemetery. Beyond that cemetery was a sprawling forest that the entire family often hiked through together. Caleb and Evan knew these woods better than anyone, and ever since they were young, they'd spent countless afternoons after school just exploring every inch of it. They knew every bend in the creek that ran through it, every trailhead, and every landmark that most people would never notice. These woods were like their second home. Their mother was generally fine with them exploring on their own, but she always gave them this look before they left. It was half concerned, half trusting, and she would make them promise not to go too far or stay out too long. The boys understood that their mother would be furious if they disobeyed these rules, but they also knew they couldn't possibly get lost in woods they knew so well. One afternoon, the whole family decided to take a hike together. It was a beautiful day, and they followed their usual path, cutting through the cemetery and into the woods. They walked together as a group until they reached the creek, which typically served as the halfway point on their family hikes. When they got to the creek, Caleb and Evan asked their parents if they can go a bit further upstream on their own, just to explore a little more. The parents were naturally hesitant, and their father mentioned something about them potentially getting lost, but both boys just laughed at this idea, because getting lost in these woods for them would be like getting lost in their own house. It was just impossible. So their mother, gave them that characteristic look that they knew so well, and then told them they could go, but they had to promise not to take too long. The boys eagerly agreed and set off upstream, staying close to the water's edge as they walked. They hadn't been walking for very long when they came across something that stopped them in their tracks. There, right in front of them, was a large hill that neither of them recognized or remembered seeing before. This immediately struck Caleb as strange. He and Evan had explored these woods for years, so how could there be a hill this size that they'd never noticed? But what made this discovery even more bizarre wasn't just the hill itself, it was what was on it. The entire hill was covered with debris and clutter, and there was broken furniture scattered across its surface. You had old toys strewn about, lamps discarded on the hillsides, piles of clothes heaped in places, and even a mattress that was half buried in leaves. Caleb couldn't help but think that it looked like someone had turned a house upside down and dumped all of its contents onto this hill. And so as they approached, Caleb noticed something else unusual. Many of the trees had large X's painted on them, like they had been marked for removal. Now, despite how strange all this was, their curiosity got the better of them. They carefully picked their way through the scattered debris and made it about 20 or 30 feet up the hill, examining the strange collection of items as they went. While they were exploring, they heard their mother calling their names. The sound was faint but unmistakable, and without hesitation, Caleb and Evan stopped what they were doing and headed back in the direction of her voice. The return journey was quick since they hadn't gone that far, but by Caleb's estimation, they'd only been gone for about 45 minutes. When they stepped back onto the main path, they found their parents and younger brother Micah waiting for them. Immediately, Caleb could tell something was wrong by the way his family was looking at them. His mother wasn't relieved to see them, she was furious. Before they could explain where they'd been, she started scolding them severely. She demanded to know where they had been all this time. What had confused Caleb the most was when his mother insisted that they had been gone for hours and not minutes. According to his parents, after the boys left to go upstream, some time passed and they grew concerned when Caleb and Evan did not return. The parents and Micah had been searching for them, calling out their names repeatedly, for what they claimed was hours. They said they couldn't find any sign of the boys until now. Caleb and Evan couldn't defend themselves because they were completely bewildered. I mean, how could it have been hours? They were sure that they had only been gone for 45 minutes at the most. And so, in desperation, they offered to show their mother the strange hill covered with debris to prove where they had been. So they turned to point out the hill's location, but it was gone. All they saw was normal forest with trees and gentle land contours. There was no hill, there was no debris, there was no furniture, none of that existed. Nothing unusual. So they began frantically retracing their steps, and they're like, this had to have been here. Like, how could a hill go missing? And then they started looking for turnoffs from the main path that might lead to it, but they didn't find any. It's as if it didn't exist. And they searched for any slope where a hill might have been, but again, there was none of it. Well, after a while, they eventually gave up, and so the very next day, Caleb and Evan returned to the search for the hill again, but as you can imagine, their search was unsuccessful. Now, over the weeks, months, and even years that came after, finding this hill became somewhat of an obsession for both of them. But as they got older, they employed more sophisticated search methods, mapping the woods systematically, taking different trails, deliberately veering off the paths, anything that might lead them back to that hill. But despite their efforts, spanning the years, they never found it again. It seemed as if the hill and everything on it had simply never existed. They even asked other people in the area about it, but nobody else had knowledge of the hill they described. As an adult, Caleb still remains mystified by what he experienced, and he acknowledges that the only logical explanation would be that they had simply got turned around in the woods and lost track of time during their exploration. Despite this logical possibility, he believes something else happened that day. He believes the hill truly existed for that brief period when he and his brother discovered it, and then somehow blinked out of existence after their visit. On the early morning hours of June 18th, 2005, a man named Marcus Blacksmith and his two best friends were loading their mountain bikes onto the back of Marcus's truck. The three of them had been planning this trip for a while. They were going to spend the day mountain biking at Snowshoe Mountain Resort in southern West Virginia. They were very excited to get out there and hit the trails, so they left pretty early to make the most of the day. Marcus was driving his truck down the interstate, heading towards southern West Virginia, and at some point, they took an exit that they thought would lead them to Snowshoe. But pretty quickly, they realized they might have taken a wrong turn somewhere. They ended up on these really small, winding back roads that weren't on their map. They were basically lost in rural West Virginia. Down, 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 down. Around 9 in the morning, after driving on these roads for a while, Marcus and his friends came up on this tiny little town. As they drove in, the first thing they noticed was that the place seemed completely deserted. There were no cars moving, no people walking around, nobody. At first, they thought maybe it was just a really quiet town, but the more they looked around, the weirder it got. There were businesses that looked open. Lights were on, doors unlocked, but there wasn't a single person anywhere. Marcus pulled his truck up and parked it right in what seemed like the center of town. They all got out and decided that since they were lost anyway, they might as well try to find someone to ask for directions to Snowshoe. The three friends agreed that they should split up to cover more ground, thinking they'd find someone faster that way. Marcus went into what looked like the local post office. The door was unlocked, so he just walked right in. And inside, there was nobody there. But he could see mail and packages that were all sorted behind the counter like someone had been working there recently. It looked like someone had just stepped away for a moment, but the place was completely empty. Next, he checked out the town's only bar. The door was open, music was playing on the sound system, and there were even glasses on the counter like the place was ready for business, but again, not a single person inside. No bartender, there was no customers anywhere around, and after about 25 minutes of searching, the three friends met back up in the center of town. None of them had found a single person anywhere. And they're all starting to feel pretty unsettled by the entire situation. Marcus was telling his friends about the bar with the music playing and the post office and all of that, and they're just thinking, how is this possible? How is there literally nobody around? And as they're standing there talking, This elderly man kind of appeared in the middle of the street. What made it so weird was that none of them saw where he came from. He just kind of materialized out of nowhere. He was wearing typical rural clothing and had a really weathered face. Marcus didn't even start with asking for directions. The first thing he said to the old man was, "Where the hell is everyone?" And the old man, who seemed pretty unfazed by the question, just calmly told him that folks around here don't really get up until around noon. Marcus and his friends looked at each other because that explanation made no sense. It was already well into the morning hours, like 9:30 at this point. Normal people don't just sleep until noon on a regular workday. Eventually, Marcus asked the old man for directions to Snowshoe Mountain Resort. The old man pointed to the road they had come in on and told them to go back that way about 10 miles, then make a right to find the interstate. But what bothered Marcus was that the old man wasn't actually giving them directions to Snowshoe. He was just telling them how to get back to the interstate. There was something about his demeanor that was really off-putting. I mean, he was very matter-of-fact, but something just felt off about the interaction. Marcus and his friends quickly thanked him and hurried back to the truck. They were kind of freaked out at this point, and they just wanted to get out of there. As they drove out from town, they kept looking back, but there was still no sign of any other people. And when they looked for the old man, he was already gone. In the truck, they were all talking about how weird the entire experience was and how it felt like they were being watched, even though the town seemed completely empty. But the strangeness wasn't over yet. About 5 miles down the road, as they were driving on this long straightaway, they spotted a woman standing in the middle of the road. She was wearing what looked like an official state road uniform and was holding one of those stop slow signs that flaggers use at construction sites. As they approached, she turned her sign from slow to stop. Marcus stopped the truck and rolled down his window to ask what was going on and how long they'd be delayed. The woman kindly explained to them that there was road construction ahead and they'd have to wait. Marcus and his friends started telling her about the strange town they'd just come from, and she kind of just laughed a little and explained that those people in that town are kind of strange. Bizarrely, it was evident that there was no construction vehicles anywhere. No equipment, no workers, nothing that would indicate any road work was happening. They also realized this flag woman had no vehicle nearby either. She was just kind of standing there in the middle of the road with her sign. The flag woman kept them stopped for about 45 minutes to an hour, saying they had to wait for traffic coming from the opposite direction to pass. But during the entire time, there was no vehicle that came. They kept looking down the road, but there was nothing that looked like construction happening anywhere. Despite all of this, the woman maintained this friendly, casual conversation with them the entire time. And after almost an hour, she suddenly announced that she guessed it was clear now and they can go ahead. She slowly turned her sign from stop to slow and motioned for them to drive forward. They all kept watching in the rearview mirror as the woman got smaller in the distance. Now here's what's crazy is, for the next 30 plus miles, they saw no signs of any construction or any construction workers. In the truck, they were just talking about how strange this was, and by this point, they were pretty disturbed by the experience. Eventually, they decided to just abandon their plans to go mountain biking and head home. They finally found the interstate, just like the old man had said they would. They tried to research small towns in that area, but never managed to identify which specific town they visited. None of them have ever gone back to try to find it again. In the summer of 1956, a civil engineer named Tony Clark was working in the Middle East. Tony had been sent to the small town of Manjil, Iran, about 150 miles from Tehran, to survey the damage from a devastating earthquake that had destroyed the entire community. The roads leading to and from Manjil were in terrible condition, just completely torn up from the earthquake. And on this particular day, Tony and his Iranian colleague, another engineer, had spent hours just walking through the ruins and assessing damage and making plans for rebuilding. And I mean, this was exhausting work. I mean, think about it. They'd been out in the blistering sun all day. They barely had anything to eat, just some unleavened bread that crumbled like old plaster and stuck to their teeth, and this thin, lukewarm yogurt drink served in these dirty metal cups that reeked of garlic. That's enough to scare away vampires. By late afternoon, both men were completely drained, physically and mentally. They decided it was time to begin the long 150-mile journey back to Tehran. So they got into their car, which had these absolutely horrible shock absorbers, and began bouncing along the cracked, uneven roads. As they drove, Tony developed this pounding headache that just kept getting worse. It wasn't just from the bouncing, he was also starving. That hunger was actually spreading to his joints, making his neck all stiff and uncomfortable. They still had about 120 miles to go before reaching Tehran, and as far as they knew, the nearest settlement was at least 50 miles away. The sun was starting to set, and Tony was wondering how much longer he could take this. But then, as they crested a hill onto this flat stretch of road, Tony spotted something in the distance. A small settlement, just a collection of mud huts and buildings. As they got closer, the village looked tired and worn down, but Tony noticed something really distinctive about it. There was this pile of rocks with one large boulder balanced perfectly on top. It looked almost unnatural, like it was too perfect to have happened by chance. They drove into the village and pulled their car to a stop behind a bus. When Tony got out, his legs felt wobbly from the combination of hunger and fatigue, and he noticed other drivers had stopped in the village too. At the edge of the village, Tony and his colleague spotted this long, low building that looked like it might be a Che Khana, which is basically a roadside cafe. They were hoping they could at least get some tea or water there, so they headed inside. The interior was dark and cool compared to the blinding sun outside, and it took a moment for their eyes to adjust. Tony could smell smoke and herbs and something citrusy in the air, and as his vision cleared, Tony began to make out the details of the place. The walls were bare stone, stained from age. There was this stylized portrait of a man with wide, sorrowful eyes hanging on one wall, and other drivers were lounging along the walls in simple rope and wood beds, some of them smoking hookahs. In the middle of the floor were wooden tables. A man approached them quickly, but with this slight hesitation in his step, and he looked to be in his 40s, medium height, with thin hair that was carefully combed back. He greeted them in perfect English, though he seemed a bit nervous for some reason. He introduced himself as vanishing and mentioned he was from Armenia. Tony explained that they were starving, they hadn't eaten all day, and when he heard this, the man brightened up and told them they rarely saw foreigners there. And he mentioned that he and his wife were, as he put it, decent cooks, and led them to a central table before disappearing to prepare their meal. So Tony and his colleague just sat there hoping they'd get something substantial. After a few minutes, the man's wife came out carrying a tablecloth and silverware, and she had this kind of round, happy face and wore an apron over a pale blue dress. Like her husband, she also seemed nervous and moved very carefully, almost like she was used to being watched. Tony noticed that the other travelers would occasionally glance at them and then quickly look away. What happened next was extraordinary. The meal was served course by course, starting with this ice-cold soup with yogurt, raisins, cucumber, and flavors Tony couldn't even identify. It had this silky texture with sweetness from the raisins behind the tang of the yogurt. Tony thought it was quite possibly the most delicious soup he had ever tasted, which Hovaneshin offered somewhat discreetly. Tony thought it was some of the best he'd ever had. After that, they were served dolmas, which is vine leaves stuffed with rice, meat, and herbs. The flavors were subtle but in perfect balance. Tony was so impressed that he asked the man for the recipe, but the man dodged the question. He only mentioned where the rice came from, keeping all the other ingredients vague before retreating to the kitchen. The meal continued with chelo kebab, which is a famous Iranian dish, and finished with strong Turkish coffee. Tony couldn't comprehend how such excellent food existed in this remote location. It just seemed impossible. And so when the man returned to indicate the meal was over, Tony explained to him that it was the best meal he had ever had. Hovaneshin just beamed with pride, like he'd never heard such a compliment before. He repeated that they rarely saw outsiders and encouraged Tony to visit again, bring friends, and tell others about it. When Tony asked for the bill, The man hesitated for a moment before naming an astonishingly low price. Tony happily paid for both meals and made special note of the mileage so he can find it again. The rest of the journey back to Tehran was uneventful, but in the following weeks, Tony told everybody about this incredible restaurant he'd found. The thing is, no one believed his story because they kept telling him that such quality food was impossible in that location because delicacies like that were unheard of outside major cities. And the traffic in such remote areas would be far too light to sustain that kind of business, and high-quality food shipments to tiny villages just weren't plausible. Even in Tehran, they said, such a meal would cost at least 5 times more. Well, a few months later, Tony had to return to Manjil to check on the rebuilding progress. This time, he was traveling with an English engineer instead of his original colleague. The English engineer was one of those who didn't believe Tony's story originally, and Tony was determined to prove him wrong. Like the first trip, they barely ate during the day while working in Manjil, and when they started the journey back to Tehran, Tony was watching the odometer carefully to find the exact location. When they were about 5 miles out, Tony announced they were almost there, and he recognized all the familiar landmarks like mountain slopes, signposts, and the low huts. And most convincingly, he spotted that distinctive rock pile with the boulder balanced on top. They drove into the village, which appeared unchanged. They stopped in the same place as before, but when Tony looked for the cafe, it was gone. There was no building, no foundation, not even any signs, just a flat patch of dirt. Tony was now completely confused and angry. He got out of the car and started pacing back and forth, just searching frantically for any signs of demolition. Nearby, he spotted a villager and just repeatedly asked him about the cafe, the Chaykhana, but the villager appeared genuinely confused and explained to Tony that there had never been one in all the time this person has been there, and that's 40 years. But Tony continued to search the man's face for signs of deception but found none. Reluctantly, he accepted that he would never see the cafe or Hovaneshin again. They drove back to Tehran hungry and quiet, and the English engineer remained unconvinced about the whole thing. Tony tried to understand what happened, but he never found an explanation. The only conclusion he could reach was that the experience had been real because the food satisfied their hunger, and all 5 of his senses had confirmed the experience. However, somehow, this place never existed. On the morning of October 12th, 2018, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell was sitting around a campfire with her best friend and several other people at a big state park in the mountains. Sarah and her friend were both in their early 20s, while everyone else in the camping group was quite a bit older, like in their 30s and 40s. The group had brought horses with them for riding. However, there weren't enough horses for everyone to ride at once, so they had decided the night before they would take turns. Sarah and her best friend had volunteered to go riding first thing in the morning. So, as Sarah and her friend were getting ready to head out, the older members of the group began cracking jokes about not getting lost. One of them told Sarah that darkness falls quickly in the mountains and being lost in the middle of nowhere would be very dangerous. Of course, Sarah laughed it off and assured them that they'd be fine. She and her friend then mounted their horses and headed off into the woods. Well, after a couple of hours, Sarah and her friend returned to the campsite, having enjoyed their ride with no issues. They handed the horses over to the older group, who were eager for their return. Sarah watched as the group of 30 and 40-somethings rode off from the campsite, leaving just her and her best friend behind. Well, as the day went on, Sarah and her friend relaxed around the camp, making dinner and telling stories. She noticed the sun beginning to set over the mountains, and remembered what the older campers had said about darkness falling quickly. Sure enough, within what seemed like minutes, the entire area was plunged into darkness. Time continued to pass, and Sarah began to grow concerned. The older group should have been back by now. She looked at her watch and realized they were over an hour late. So she turned to her friend and mentioned that something might be wrong. Just as they were discussing whether they should go looking for the others, Sarah's phone rang. It was one of the older campers calling in distress. They explained that they had gotten completely lost. Apparently, One woman in the group who was on some new medication had convinced everyone to follow her down what turned out to be a steep deer trail and not a proper path at all. To make matters worse, one person who had recently had surgery had fallen off their horse and was in pain. The group was now stranded in the dark in the middle of nowhere, and they needed Sarah and her friend to come rescue them. After hanging up, Sarah and her best friend quickly discussed their options. They decided bringing the horse trailer would be too difficult on the unknown terrain, so they opted to take the car instead. The lost group sent their location via a Google Maps pin, and Sarah and her friend headed out to find them. They drove along a highway for about 15 minutes before the GPS indicated they needed to make a turn. Sarah slowed down, peering through the darkness until she finally spotted a hidden turnoff from the highway. Now by this point, it was completely dark outside, and their visibility was very limited to just a few feet ahead of them, illuminated only by the car's headlights. As they turned onto this new road, Sarah felt the surface change beneath them from smooth pavement to rough gravel. The further they drove, the narrower the road became. The terrain started getting increasingly hilly, with steep uphill and downhill sections that made Sarah grip the steering wheel. And after driving for about 20 minutes on this treacherous road, Sarah and her friend suddenly came across a farmhouse. The house looked incredibly old and dilapidated, like it might collapse at any moment. So she slowed the car down and looked out her window, and she could see barbed wire scattered across what must have been the front lawn, along with all kinds of debris just strewn around. As they approached the house, Sarah noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. There was a dark figure standing on the porch, completely motionless, just watching them as they drove by. Sarah nudged her friend and pointed, and they both agreed it was probably a person, but in the darkness, they couldn't be so sure. Something about the entire scene felt deeply unsettling, but they continued past the house, focused on their mission to find their friends. Just a few minutes after passing the strange farmhouse, Sarah and her friend finally located the lost riding group. Everybody was visibly distressed, understandably so, especially the person who had fallen off their horse. The horses themselves looked tired and spooked from the ordeal, and after a brief discussion, they came up with a plan to get everyone back to camp safely. They turned the car around on the narrow road, which was no easy task. Some of the riders got into the car with Sarah, while others remained with their horses for the return journey. They decided to take turns between tasks. One person would drive the car at the front of the group, while the other would lead the remaining horses on foot. Their progress was painfully slow due to the steep terrain and the darkness. As they navigated back toward the highway, Sarah realized they were approaching the area where they had seen the farmhouse earlier, and she began to tense up, preparing herself to see that dark figure on the porch again. For some reason, the figure seemed so out of place initially that it spooked her. But as they reached the spot where the farmhouse had been, she was shocked because the house was gone. In fact, there was no sign of the building. There was no barbed wire, there was no debris, and certainly no dark figure watching them from the porch. Of course, realizing this, she blinked hard and she's looking, wondering if she had somehow missed it in the darkness, but there was nothing there. Sarah glanced over at her friend, wondering if she had noticed, but her friend was focused on handling the horses. Sarah didn't mention it. Part of her wondered if she was just overly tired and had imagined it all. And so they continued their journey back toward the highway and eventually made it back to camp. By the time everyone was safely back, it was well past midnight. Now, despite the ordeal, everyone was safe, if a bit shaken up. And so as the group sat around the campfire recounting their adventure, Sarah remained quiet and decided not to share any of the information on the mysterious disappearing house. In fact, she never told anybody about what she had seen, or rather, what she hadn't seen on the return journey. On the afternoon of July 12, 2003, a 19-year-old man named Benjamin was crawling around the cliffside of the Niagara Escarpment with his friends when he noticed something he'd never seen before. There was an opening in the rock face that appeared to go much deeper than the typical shallow caverns they usually explored. Ben and his friends had grown up near the area, this long ridge of sedimentary rock that stretched across the Great Lakes region, so they were pretty familiar with a lot of the caves and crevices. Ben had always been into outdoor activities and exploration since he was a kid, and by the time he was 19, he knew the local geography pretty well. He and his friends had already explored several known caves in the area before without any issues. They were basically just young kids looking for adventure on weekends. So, on this particular day, Benjamin and his friends had been out hiking since morning, and they'd packed fairly lightly, just bringing some water and some food, but nobody brought flashlights because, it was daytime and they weren't planning on going into any of the deep caves. Ben only had a cigarette lighter in his pocket, just in case. Earlier that day, they checked out a few of the shallow caves they already knew about. These caves were the kind of places where teenagers would hang out sometimes, so they usually had beer cans and other trash littered inside. Nothing special. But around 1:30 in the afternoon, they ventured into a smaller, less familiar section of the escarpment. That's when Ben spotted an opening. He pointed this out to his friends, and they all realized they'd never seen this particular cave before. Even though they didn't have flashlights with them, their curiosity got the better of them. They decided to check it out. Ben was the first one to step into the entrance. The second he went inside, he noticed how much colder it was in there, like 20 or 30 degrees cooler than outside. As their eyes began adjusting to the darkness, they looked around and noticed something strange. This cave was unusually clean. Unlike all the other local caves they'd been in, there was no beer, no graffiti, no signs that anyone had ever been in here before. And that struck Ben as really weird because pretty much every accessible cave in the area had at least some kind of human trash or markings. But the group decided to move deeper, using their cigarette lighters to see where they were going. They hadn't gone very far when Ben began to feel strange. He couldn't exactly explain why, but something just felt off, and he started noticing these strange sounds coming from deeper inside. Initially, he tried to ignore it, but he felt this weird sensation on the back of his neck, like somebody was watching him. He didn't say anything about it right away because he didn't want his friends to think he was being a chicken. But then, one by one, his friends began acting weird too. He felt something brush against his arm when nobody was anywhere near him. Then his friend said he felt something poke him in the back. His other friend said something had pulled on his shirt. And pretty soon, they were all experiencing these bizarre physical sensations. They started getting freaked out and accusing each other of playing pranks. Like, one of them would just say, "Hey man, stop touching me," and the other person would be like, "I'm not anywhere near you." Every time they used their lighters to check, they could see that everyone was standing apart from each other. But the strange touching just kept happening. And on top of that, they all started hearing that strange whispering sound that they couldn't exactly make out, and the temperature seemed to drop even more. Now at this point, Ben was pretty spooked. He told his friends they should leave immediately and maybe come back better equipped another time. Everyone unanimously agreed. They were all genuinely frightened, but as they turned back to head toward the entrance, the sensations of being touched actually intensified. Several of Ben's friends said they felt like something was trying to hold them back. The group started moving more quickly, trying not to completely panic. Finally, they saw a natural light up ahead indicating the entrance, and they practically ran the last few yards, desperate to get out. When they emerged, one by one, they noticed something off. The lighting conditions had completely changed. Instead of the early afternoon sunlight they were expecting, the sun was now low in the sky. Ben checked the time and was shocked to see it was after 5 p.m. Everybody looked at each other in disbelief because they'd been in the cave for over 3 hours. But they'd only been in there realistically like 20 or 30 minutes at most. None of them could account for the missing time or even remember what happened during that time. They all checked their watches and phones, confirming that yes, somehow, more than 3 hours had just passed. So they just stood there, shocked, trying to process what had happened. None of it made any sense. The hike back to their starting point was pretty quiet. I mean, everybody was lost in their thoughts, trying to make sense of what they had experienced. It turned out that they'd all felt similar things, the weird touches, the noises, and the feelings of being watched. But nobody could explain the missing time or what even happened during those hours they couldn't remember. Several of Ben's friends said they felt like they were being watched from the surrounding forest as they walked back as well. It was creepy, and they were all shaken up by the experience. Before they went their separate ways that evening, they made concrete plans to return the following weekend. They'd figured they'd bring proper equipment next time, flashlights, chalk to mark their path, watches to keep track of time, and they wanted to investigate this weird cave properly. So, a week later, on July 19th, they got back together, this time properly equipped, and they returned to the escarpment and began searching for the cave they'd found the previous weekend. But, despite careful searching, they couldn't locate the specific rock formation anymore. The distinctive, deep, clean cave was nowhere to be found. They began to suspect that they must be in the wrong location entirely, or that they were in exactly the right place. The cave was just somehow gone. They spent hours looking for it, and eventually, as daylight began to wane, they reluctantly gave up the search. Now, over the next few weeks of late summer in 2003, Ben and various friends made attempts to find the cave. They searched and searched high and low, but it was like the cave had simply disappeared. It was never located again. Interestingly, Ben did talk to some friends of his about it informally, and there was a few suggestions that maybe seasonal changes in vegetation had somehow obscured the entrance, or, perhaps a minor rockfall had sealed or altered the opening, but they don't know. Or they might have accessed the cave through some temporary opening that had since closed, but none of these explanations really seem to account for the entire experience, especially the missing time and what they felt inside the cave. Ben and his friends believe that to this day, they experienced a time slip of some kind, and that there was something wrong about that cave. Unfortunately, the cavern's history, what or who was in it, and how it could vanish remains unexplained. And because you've made it this far in the episode, I want you to all comment below, blink, and you'll miss it. So that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we deep dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural, what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now so you don't ever miss another episode. As always, never forget, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.